Thought you guys wouldn't mind a book story. Back in about 1988. Okay, so next week even, is my 29th anniversary of coming to Michigan. So, of course, I made my way to all of the bookstores in the area. And within the first year, I was going through Kriegel, and I'd find these old waterlogged books. This is like $5. 1838, and it even was mildewed and so on. But I was interested in it. I got about 4 of these because 1838, this came out of Yale Seminary. This is about the time that the Presbyterian Church had split, and I wanted to read the information on the other side of the arguments. These people would have been defending Albert Barnes and so on, but I thought I was still single then, so I got away with buying books like this, because now if I brought it home, she would say, "Wifey, don't bring that in here," and I would say, "Oh, can't we keep him? I think he's had all his shots." So, but the reason I came across this book this week by accident, and the reason I brought it up is because of what I talked about in Vanity Fair last week, and that is amusements. And there's a review of an article in here of a book on theatrical amusements, and keep in mind this is 1837, 180 years ago, that this book was written by a 29-year-old pastor. And I just want to read a couple of sentences in the review because it's so gripping if you consider what they didn't have in those days, moving pictures, televisions, and so on. And this is what it says in the paragraph. "Degeneracy is its natural tendency." That's the theater. "By one trespass upon decency, it prepares a way for another. Novelty is a ruling law of pleasure, and the only novelty of a licentious stage is in newer designs of corruption. And one and another startling breach upon public propriety. So it is constantly putting out its feelers," and this is so interesting because of how bad things have gotten in our own country through desensitization of those outside of Christ. What is being advertised, what is being marketed to us, and so on. But this sentence is so powerful considering it's 179 years old. He says, "It is constantly the theater, the people that put the stuff together, putting out its feelers and trying the moral pulse of the community in order to ascertain how much of increased indecency the patient will bear. Oh, if we have ever felt a sinking of soul within us, if we have ever given way to despondency in regard to the perpetuity of our free institutions, it was when American virtue stooped to this." I almost simply can't believe this, because these people had no idea in 1837 and 1838 what some of the stuff that we're having paraded before us in our day would become. So back to Pilgrim's Progress, one mocking merchant observed the strange behavior of faithful and Christian and said to them, "What will you buy?" The pilgrim looked at him with serious expressions and said, "We buy the truth." With this answer, the merchant and others took the opportunity to deride the men even more. Some mocked, some taunted, some spoke with reproach, and some called for others to strike them. It turned into a noticeable commotion and grew into a great disturbance, to the point that everywhere you looked the fair was in disorder. As a result, word quickly reached the governor of the fair. He came down right away and appointed deputies from some of his most trusted friends. He put these in charge of investigating what happened and to examine the pilgrims about why they had nearly overturned the fair. So Faithful and Christian were taken for further investigation. I'm going to show you a couple of slides because I didn't bring the charger last week, so we didn't have any PowerPoint presentations, and these are a couple of things that I had put together. You know, the type of Vanity Fairs in our day, largest flea market in the United States. Now, I did tell you about what we witnessed in Santo Domingo on a Sunday, as far as the eyes could see, that people set up these fairs, and I mean, they're so crowded in. of course, this Vanity Fair, which, interestingly enough, I've been here 4 times in my life, and I've never been inside of one of those places. And the reason is, I was in the military. I wasn't old enough to go inside. But my roommate's natural mother, that he hadn't seen, he had never met her since he was such a youngin' when he went was given for adoption or whatever. We would go down there to visit these people. And it's only gotten worse in the last 30 years. This is an actual fair in Bunyan's day, the Bartholomew Fair and the Greenwich Fair. These are later pictures. These are probably 19th century, but they did exist in Bunyan's day. And then Vanity Fair, which is the fair that takes place in a town called Vanity. Robert Maguire said those who presided over the proceedings asked him where they came from and where they were going, and why they were wearing such unusual clothing. Faithful and Christian told them that they were pilgrims and strangers in the world, and that they were going to their own country, which was called the heavenly Jerusalem, and that they had done nothing to cause the men of the town or the merchants to mistreat them or to delay their journey. The only exception they could think of was when the merchant had asked them what they would buy, and they responded that they would buy the truth. But those who were appointed to investigate the uproar did not believe them. They thought the 2 pilgrims were nothing more than madmen and lunatics who came for the purpose of throwing the fair into confusion. Therefore they took them and they beat them and they smeared them with dirt and they put them into a cage as a spectacle in front of all of the men of the fair. Finding that they could prevail nothing against these men, but that rather a tumult was made, the men of the fair are impelled to yet more vigorous measures in order to suppress the protest against it by the pilgrims. Their bondage is now made bitter to them, and the iron enters into their very soul. It is in that cage or prison of Vanity Fair that Bunyan now writes his narrative. And as he looks around upon his bondage and looks within to search out the cause of it, he reads in his own experience and in that of many of the tried and suffering members of Christ. This and the following scenes of the Progress. How descriptive is the whole picture rendered by the names of the respective parties who rise in opposition to Christian and faithful. Each man's name, now there were 12 juries, and Bunyan names them all, and each of their names speak the personification of some spiritual or earthly form of the antagonism of the world to the church and the people of God. Now, if you've ever read this account, you'll remember that the judge's name is Judge Hategood. And I asked myself as I'm reading this, is this stuff embellished? Is this stuff really historical? And this morning, while the family was having breakfast, I hadn't looked at this yet. I had looked at all of the other characters in here, but I knew that Alexander White, the Scottish pastor who died in 1921, dealt with Judge Hategood and said that he had nothing on Judge Jeffreys, who lived in England in those days, before whom Bunyan and Richard Baxter and others stood before, and they said that Judge Hategood in Pilgrim's Progress had nothing on Judge Jeffreys that lived in England in the day. And I caught this sentence: he was the most consummate bully that ever disgraced an English bench. I mean, this guy was fierce. And as we go on, I'll open that up a bit, but I told you I'd give you just a little taste of the history of the martyrs. When I mentioned Fox's Book of Martyrs, I said that the original title was Acts and Monuments, and it was 8 volumes. So much of that in the modern versions of Fox's Book of Martyrs has been edited, abridged, but added to things that went on after the fact. So this story is from 1761. We pass over many other individual martyrdoms to insert that of John Colosse, which took place as recently as 1761 and is an indubitable proof of the bigotry of popery. John Colosse was a merchant of the city Toulouse, where he had been settled and lived in good repute and had married an English woman of French extraction. So they have 5 sons, educated in the same religion, One of the sons becomes a Roman Catholic, having been converted by a maidservant who had lived with the family about 30 years. One of the other sons, Mark Antony, was bred to the law. In other words, he wanted to go into the legal profession, but could not be admitted to practice on account of his being a Protestant. So he grew melancholy, read all the books he could procure relative to suicide, and seemed determined to destroy himself. To this may be added that he led a dissipated life, was greatly addicted to gaming, and did all which could constitute the character of a libertine, on which account his father frequently reprehended him, and sometimes in terms of severity, which considerably added to the gloom that seemed to oppress him. So it's 13th of October, 1761. Mr. Gobert Lavais, a young gentleman about 19 years of age, the son of Lavais, a celebrated advocate of Toulouse, about 5 o'clock in the evening, was met by John Calas, the father, and the eldest son, Mark Antony, who was a friend. The father invited them to supper, and the family and their guests sat down in a room up one of the stairs. It was now about 7 o'clock. The supper was not long, but before it was over, Antony left the table and went into the kitchen, which was on the same floor, as he was accustomed to do. The maid asked him if he was cold. He answered quite the contrary, "I burn," and then left her. In the meantime, his friend and family left the room they had supped in and went into the bedchamber, so they go in to have fellowship. On the ground floor of Calas's house was a shop and a warehouse, the latter of which was divided from the shop by a pair of folding doors. When Peter Calas and Lavais came downstairs into the shop, they were extremely shocked to see Antony hanging in his shirt from a bar which he had laid across the top of the two folding doors, having half opened them for that purpose, so he had set something up for which he could commit suicide. On the discovery of this horrid spectacle, they shrieked out, which brought down Calas the father, the mother being seized with such terror as kept her trembling in the passage above. In the meantime, Peter had been sent for Lamour, a surgeon in the neighborhood. Mr. Grosselet came instantly. Upon examination, he found the body quite dead, and by this time a papistical crowd of people, a number of Catholics in the area, were gathered about the house, and having by some means heard that Antony Calas was suddenly dead and that the surgeon had examined the body, declared that he had been strangled. They took it into their heads that he had been murdered. In other words, they thought the father did it. And as the family was Protestant, they presently supposed that the young man was about to change his religion and had been put to death for that reason. So they start to spread this report. The father murdered the child because he was going to become a Catholic so that he could get into the legal profession. The poor father, overwhelmed with grief for the loss of his child, was advised by his friends to send for the officers of justice to prevent his being torn to pieces by the Catholic multitude who supposed he had murdered his son. This was accordingly done, and David, the chief magistrate, or Capitol, took the father, Peter the son, the mother, Lavais, and the maid all into custody and set a guard over them. So now they're all in custody because of a false report. The Capitol continued the persecution with unrelenting severity, and without the least proof coming in, thought fit to condemn the unhappy father. So the father's mourning the grief and the loss of the son terribly. He's so broken. And they spread this false report about him. To make a long story short, the rest of the family got off, but poor Calas, however, an old man of 68, was condemned to the dreadful punishment alone. He suffered a torture with great constancy and was led to execution in a frame of mind which excited the admiration of all that saw him, and particularly of the two Dominicans who attended him in his last moments, and declared that they thought him not only innocent of the crime laid to his charge, but also an exemplary instance of true Christian patience, fortitude, and charity. When he saw the executioner prepared to give him the last stroke, he made a fresh declaration to Father Borges. But while the words were still in his mouth, the Capitol, the author of this catastrophe, who came upon the scaffold merely to gratify his desire of being a witness of his punishment and death, ran up to him and bawled out, "Wretch, there are faggots which are here to reduce your body to ashes. Speak the truth. Mr. Coloss made no reply, but turned his head a little aside, and that moment the executioner did his office. The popular outcry against his family was so violent in Languedoc that everybody expected to see the children of Coloss broke upon the wheel and the mother burnt alive, but thankfully that didn't happen. So Faithful and Christian were once again dragged before their examiners and charged as guilty, back to the story, for causing the disturbance in the fair. As their punishment, they were beaten unmercifully, hung in irons, and led in chains up and down the lanes of the fair, as an example and warning to others who might think to speak on behalf of the pilgrims or to associate with them. Even in all this, Christian and Faithful behaved with increasing wisdom and with much meekness and patience amid the humiliation and shame heaped upon them. With such behavior, they won several of the men in the fair to their side, though the number was few in comparison to the rest. This generated even more rage in the aggressive opponents, to the point that they sought the death of the two captives. When a convenient time was determined, the prisoners were brought forth for their trial in order that they could be found guilty and condemned. They were brought before their enemies and were formally accused. The judge's name was Lord Hategood. Their indictment was essentially the same accusation, but had been changed slightly in content. It read that Christian and Faithful were enemies to and disturbers of the trading of the fair, and that they had caused commotions and divisions in the town, and had in the process gained supporters for their most dangerous opinions in contempt of the law of their prince. So one of the jurors, witnesses, when pick thank, and that word means to pick what things you can be thanked for. It means that he was always searching for praise, so Bunyan calls him pick thank. Had finished giving his account of the evidence against Faithful, the judge turned his attention to the prisoner at the bar and talked to him directly. "You deserter of the truth, you heretic and traitor, have you heard what these honest gentlemen have testified against you?" Faithful asked, "May I speak a few words in my own defense?" "You contemptible, good-for-nothing vagrant. You don't deserve to live a moment longer. Instead, you should be put to death immediately. Right here, right now." So here's the name of the jury: Blind Man, Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Lovelust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, Mr. Hate Light, and Mr. Implacable. And they went out to deliberate and consider a verdict. So you would say that the jury is stacked against Faithful here and Christian. Each individual offered their private verdict against the prisoner, and they unanimously concluded that he was guilty. First, the foreman of the jury, Mr. Blyman, said, "I see clearly that this man is a heretic." Then Mr. No Good added, "Away with such a fellow from the earth." Faithful was condemned to be returned to his prison cell and there to be put to death by the cruelest method they could think of. So they led him away to do with him according to their law. First they scourged him, then they beat him, then they lanced his flesh with knives. After that they stoned him with stones, they pricked him with their swords, and last of all they burned him to ashes at the stake. Again, I ask, is this embellished? So there's a book some of you may have seen called Mary Bunyan, the Blind Daughter of the Dreamer, written in the 1800s, and this is from that book. "It is a cold, piercing morning in January 1661. Everything in Bedford is astir betimes, for it is the meeting of the quarter sessions, and it has been noised throughout this whole country that John Bunyan is to be tried that day. Friends and foes are eager to hear his defense, for his fame has gone to every hamlet and farm station, and awakened in every breast a desire to hear the man who had so nobly withstood the justice, and that right Judas. The courtroom is a scene of eager expectancy. The crowd is partly assembled. The prisoner is expected every moment. The justices, seated on all their consequential dignity, prepared to enter with zest on the work before them. There are 5 of them: Keeling, Blundell, Leecher, Chester, and Snag. Little do they think, vain, insolent minions of a tyrant king, that the prisoner whom they now await with chafed indignation is to hand down their names to posterity covered with opprobrium. that this day's proceedings is to fix upon them everlasting disgrace, to enter them as red-letter names forever in the almanac of persecution. The felon, John Bunyan — Bunyan had been in jail for some time already — is brought before the jailer. He's brought in by the jailer and placed in the prisoner's box. All attention is directed to him. He bears himself calmly and unmoved. No earthly hand is there to support him, but he finds his support in leaning on the omnipotent arm. They bid him rise up. He stands. All eyes are fixed upon him. Unwaveringly on his judges, the indictment is produced. The clerk of the sessions rises and reads it. John Bunyan of the town of Bedford, laborer, does devilishly and perniciously abstain from coming to church to hear divine service, and is a common upholder of several unlawful meetings. Those unlawful meetings in the day were called conventicles. And it got to where that was the only way that true Protestant Christians that weren't part of the Church of England could even have any meetings. So they called them unlawful meetings, conventicles, to the great disturbance and distraction of the good subjects of this kingdom, contrary to the laws of our sovereign Lord. Prisoner, what do you say to this? He asks in a voice which indicates his rage and contempt. The prisoner answers calmly and unflinchingly, as to the first part of it, I am a common frequenter of the Church of God, and I am also by grace a member of the people over whom Christ is the head. The blood mounts to the face of Justice Keeling, who acts as judge on the occasion. He is enraged that a prisoner and a tinker should dare thus reply in the presence of the officers of the crown. He is a vindictive man, ready at all times to deal vengeance upon those who dare to oppose the civil laws of which he is the insolent representative. Assuming such importance as he can, he addresses the prisoner imperatively. Do you come to church? You know what I mean. To the parish church, to hear divine service. No, I do not, is the firm reply. And why don't you? Because I cannot find it commanded in the Word of God, answers the noble confessor right boldly. We are commanded to pray, but not by the common prayer book. How then will you tell me, you insolent one? With the Spirit, as the apostle says, I will pray with the Spirit and the understanding, says Bunyan. Who is your God, Beelzebub? You seem possessed of the spirit of delusion and of the devil. And Justice Leach shakes his head in the madness of his rage. The prisoner regards him with a steady, firm look, but answers not to his vile accusations. Sally Rochester Ford, Mary Bunyan, the dreamer's blind daughter. When I gave, that's an antique copy of that book, when I gave the introduction to this class and the history of John Bunyan, I talked about that he was put in prison as part of a 4-part act called the Clarendon Code. So what Bunyan may not have known around him, what became known as the killing times. And this is what was going on in the southwestern part of Scotland with the Scottish Covenanters. And they had to bow to the King James the 7th of Scotland at the time was James the 2nd of England, and Charles the 2nd before that, and they refused to do that, and so many of these people were put to death. That's James Guthrie of Scotland, who's given a speech before he's hanged because he said, I will not proclaim that King James is the head of our church. These were Presbyterians. They covenanted together and they took a stand and they suffered. For 28 years this went on, from 1660 to 1688, and it became known as the killing times. Margaret Wilson, a 20-year-old young lady and a 60-year-old lady, also named Margaret, were fastened to a stake because they would not take the pledge to King James. And of course, as the water would rise with the tide, they knew it would drown her. But what they did is they took the older lady and put her further out to sea, hoping that the younger Margaret would see the persecution and death of the 6-year-old, and she would retract, and to their surprise they stood firm and bold, and they both drowned. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but remember the Bible says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." I'll give you a little history again, because I keep mentioning the Post-Reformation Digital Library. And in there's a whole section of books by the Puritans. And this one caught my eye because they used to chronicle how the enemies of God sometimes suffered what obviously were God's judgments against them for the things that they did. I'll get into this in a minute. The Theater of God's Judgments, the whole title of this book is, wherein is represented the admirable justice of God against all notorious sinners, great and small, especially the most eminent persons in the world, whose exorbitant power had broke through the bars of divine and human law, collected out of sacred ecclesiastical and pagan histories by two most reverend doctors in the divinity. So that was Thomas Taylor, was one of the authors, and I had other of his books. But I mentioned the Post-Reformation Digital Library. I have gone title by title through the thousands of books that are photocopied because I wanted to take a look at them. And I wanted to know, well, what all did the Puritans write? I've gone through every title also of the Puritan hard drive because this stuff is so interesting to me. I mean, that's my entertainment. But I'm going to talk about this in just a second. And this is a book by Henry C. Fish, who wrote the book Primitive Piety Revised. So this is what it says. I told you about a book called Deathbed Scenes. Davis W. Clark, 1851, the pastor from New York, that during the time of the plague, I mentioned this when we were talking about the man in the iron cage, and I mentioned that he had chronicled the deaths of a number of backsliders and apostates. But it's the only place I've ever seen this, and because I've never seen this in Fox's Book of Martyrs. And I showed you that book, The Theater of God's Judgments. This is what happened to some of the people who were used in the reign of Bloody Mary to persecute and put to death many of our reformers. The miserable end of many of the principal actors in the persecutions carried on during the short but infamous reign of Bloody Mary is not less striking, and is even more strongly marked by the judgments of God than that of the earliest persecutors. Gardiner, transferred from the Tower, where he had been confined by Edward VI, to be Lord Chancellor by Queen Mary, and was not inferior to Bonner. Bonner's name will live in infamy. John Bunyan mentions Bonner's name in his book, Sighs from Hell and the Groans of a Damned Soul. That's where I first learned this name. But this man exceeded him in duplicity and faithlessness. His death took place in 1555, while yet the bloody work of persecution was going on. And his last moments were embittered by the compunctions of a guilty conscience for his cruelties, when upon his deathbed he was reminded by a bishop present of Peter denying his master. "Ah," said he, "I have denied but never repented with Peter." Morgan, who succeeded Farrar as Bishop of St. David's, was stricken by the visitation of God soon after being installed in his bishopric. His food passed through his throat but rose again with great violence. In this manner, almost literally starved to death, he terminated his existence. Bishop Thornton, suffragan of Dover, was an indefatigable persecutor. One day after he had exercised his cruel tyranny upon a number of pious persons at Canterbury, he came from the chapter house to Bourne, where as he stood on a Sunday looking at his men playing at bowls, he fell down in a fit of the palsy and did not long survive. The successor of Thornton, I'll just read one more, soon after he had been ordained by Gardiner, fell down a pair of stairs in the cardinal's chamber at Greenwich and broke his neck. He had just received the cardinal's blessing. He could receive nothing worse. And so this goes on for a couple of pages, and it's a part of the story. I Remember, in the words of Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Well, this is the rest of the story that you don't hear about how judgments were brought upon these people in the days of Queen Mary who persecuted our Reformed fathers. Like Fraulein, a priest of much celebrity, fell down in the street and died on the spot. And some of this I won't even read because it would turn this class into an R-rated lecture. But I want to talk a minute about this book, The Price of Soul Liberty by Henry Fish, because it's not just the Catholics and it wasn't just the Church of England that persecuted people. Unfortunately, it was also the Congregationalists in Puritan New England who persecuted the Baptists. And the Baptists have always stood for the right to worship, the freedom to worship, and that it was wrong to put people to death because they worshipped in a different way. But it took a while. In 1636 it was enacted that if any Christian shall openly condemn the baptizing of infants or shall purposely depart the congregation at the administration of that ordinance, continuing obstinate in it, he shall be sentenced to be banished. Obadiah Holmes, who was whipped in 1651, he denied the scripturalness of infant baptism and would immerse instead of sprinkle. He moreover boldly proclaimed sentiments of soul liberty. It was not to be endured. The executioner must chastise him. The scene occurred in Boston. So this is a Baptist, particular Baptist, who, in almost all points, would hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith, except for infant baptism. His clothes were stripped from him. He was tied to the public whipping post. The cruel thongs of the three-corded whip dashed a gore from the quivering flesh as it was plied with all the strength of the brutal officer. God, however, was with him, for he says, as the strokes fell upon me, I had such a spiritual manifestation of God's presence as I never had before. And the outward pain was so removed from me that I well could bear it. Yet I felt it not, although it was grievous, as a spectator said. The man striking with all his strength, spitting in his hand 3 times with the three-corded whip, giving me therewith 30 strokes. He told the magistrates, when untied from the post, you have struck me with roses, and although God has made it easy to me, I pray God it may not be laid to your charge. I'm going to tell you another story in just a second, but where this surprised me this week, I already knew about the book that the Baptist Roger Williams wrote called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, and that his opponent was John Cotton, a Congregationalist pastor, one of the first Puritans in our land. And he was banished, Roger Williams, to Rhode Island, and because he was a Baptist, because he disagreed with some of the things that were going on. And so John Cotton wrote a reply to the Bloody Tenet called The Bloody Tenet Made Washed White in the Blood of the Lamb. And Roger Williams wrote another book to answer him called The Bloody Tenet Made More Bloody. So I knew this history in the back of my mind, but I wasn't even looking for this week. In the work of Cotton Mather called The Works of Christ in America, which is 7 volumes, I know that he chronicles as well God's sudden judgments against wicked men. But as I'm looking through this, because I haven't read all 7 volumes, I've narrated a good part of it, I've read a good part of it, but I mean, these people were such voluminous writers. It's amazing what they did with a quill and ink in the day. But in the book, Cotton Mather is defending his maternal grandfather, John Cotton. That's where he got his name, Cotton Mather. And I said to myself, this seems kind of one-sided, and that's what made me... I knew about this book by Henry Fish, which is almost... it is in print, and almost nobody sells it. You can get it for $4. This is a side of the story of us Baptists in our own country here that's very seldom even mentioned. So he says in this, Holmes was so bruised and wounded that for weeks, this man that had been whipped for being a Baptist, he could rest only on his hands and knees, and yet in this state he left home and made his way through the forest wilderness to Providence to escape a second arrest by the constable. He returned, however, afterwards to Newport, where he lived to a good old age, and in 1790 his descendants were reckoned at not less than 500 persons. To show the tone of public opinion at this time, it may be stated that John Cotton, who wrote a reply to Roger Williams' book Against Persecution and Religion, I mentioned this, The Bloody Tenet, which reply Cotton styled the bloody tenet washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb, actually justified and defended the whipping of the good pastor, Obadiah Holmes. Nor was there then in all New England a solitary minister publicly to dissent from these views of John Cotton or say a word for the liberty of conscience, with the exception of the Baptists. We take a lot for granted. Our religious liberty was bought at a great price. And the fact that these were Congregationalist Puritans who were involved in this is heartbreaking. But one of the men that I want to commend during all of this, again, was John Owen, because John Owen also saw the importance of this religious freedom, that Quakers were being put to death for being Quakers. And it's a sad story. But I'll read on a little bit more. For a public exhortation at Lynn in 1651 at the house of a friend on Sunday morning, Mr. Clark, a Baptist minister, was arrested, carried by force and made to hear a Paedo-Baptist minister. Then the next day sent to Boston and sentenced to pay 20 pounds or be whipped. Persecutions included from court records as compiled by Lewis Peyton Little, Imprisoned Preachers and Religious Liberty in Virginia. This is a list of what they had to endure. Pelted with apples and stones, ducked and nearly drowned by 20 men, commanded to take a dram or be whipped, jailed for permitting a man to pray, meeting broken up by a mob, arrested as a vagabond and schismatic, pulled down and hauled about by hair, tried to suffocate him with smoke, tried to blow him up with gunpowder, drunken rowdies put in the same cell with him, horses ridden over his hearers at jail, dragged off stage, kicked and cuffed about, shot with a shotgun, ruffians armed with bludgeons beat him, severely beaten with a whip, whipped severely by the sheriff, hands slashed while preaching. I believe Pastor Dave mentions some of that when he teaches on Baptist history, but it's important never to forget what it was like for the Baptists in the early part of our country. But also our Scottish Covenanter brethren in Scotland. From James Guthrie, the first Scottish martyr, to James Renwick, the last of them, Charles II, and James said, we want to stamp this religion out of our land. When we want to stamp it out, we don't want this to be here at all. There was no toleration of our Presbyterian, Puritan forefathers in Scotland. And so to bring this back to the book, I don't know how much John Bunyan knew about these other histories, because remember, he was in jail at the time. He didn't get out till 1672, so he would have known of some of this, because the religious toleration really came the year that Bunyan died. And thankfully James fled, because there was such an outcry against what was going on. And when William of Orange, William and Mary, became king and queen, it was really the first time in England and Scotland that there was so much more liberty. That's why it's interesting that our confession of faith was written in 1677, but we call it the 1689 confession because that's really where we felt that we had the liberty to go public with it. And so I don't have a lot more here. It's just more of a reminder of what some people have price they had to pay so that we could sit here today and people aren't going to come crashing through this door yet. But we see signs that persecution is coming because many of you heard about the Bible study over here in Hudsonville, Michigan, and people rose up and had it shut down. It was done during a lunchtime. It had been going on for years, right here at the Hudsonville High School. And these people raise such an outcry, they get this stuff shut down. So we see the storm clouds of persecution on the horizon. And it may be within a generation we're going to be paying a price for the things that we take for granted now. But while we have them, we don't want to cease to thank the Lord for them. So I want to open this up to anybody that wants to say anything. Dave, I'm not real knowledgeable about this. Is there anything that you can bring to this history? We're so much closer to it than me. And I say to my shame, I didn't study the Covenanter history like I should. There's a book by Jock Purves called, Fair Sunshine? Mm-hmm. Very good book, Banner of Truth, published. And I had a picture of, I guess I didn't get it into the PowerPoint, but there were 4 volumes that came out in 1721 that chronicle the persecution of the Scottish Covenanters, and I downloaded volume 1. But I want to say to those that have an interest in this type of stuff, all of these books are now thankfully online. I just brought this to show you. I mean, it's totally falling apart, but because of the Making of America project in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and archive.org, all of these books, all of these volumes, theological journals and so on, are coming back into print. And it's interesting to go through the old theological magazines and see some of the really, really interesting articles on Christian experience. There's one I remember narrating out of one of these called Symmetry of Christian Character, how to be balanced in every part of the Christian life. But there's no natural market for these things. When William Sprague wrote Lectures for Young People, Samuel Miller wrote the introduction, and he said there's no natural desire for these things to be in print. The excess of the titles creates the desire. In other words, people don't go looking for these things if we make them available, and that's where I'm so thankful for my brother here. He sets up book displays and so on. That's how we get people interested. They see the titles, and they may have not have heard of them, and people begin to read, and they become knowledgeable about church history, about the past, and the things that we've gone through. I want to say this about the book by Sally Rochester Ford, Mary Bunyan, the Blind Daughter of the Dreamer. As I read books like that, sometimes I wonder if there's a lot of embellishment that's in them. If you compare it to Robert Dabney's Life of Stonewall Jackson, which seems so detailed. One reason it's so good to pick up books from the 19th century, from the 1800 to 1900, is, I'll give you a little biographical information. I was not very smart in high school. I was not a reader. I did not have much of a vocabulary. I had to go, here I am, it'll be 32 years next month that I've narrated Christian, Puritan, and Reformed works. I had to go to speech class in high school so that I could learn to say the letter S without whistling. I've had to work at all of this stuff. I never finished college. So the stuff that I am giving you historically on church history and that, I've never been in a seminary class on it except for what we get here. It's just a desire to find these old books and read about what's going on. And as you start to build a little bit of the historical background, and somebody else says another part of it, sooner than later, this stuff really begins to interest you. Because, as I said when I was teaching on Adoniram Judson, the history of the American seminaries has been pretty much forgotten. Why? Was there an Andover Theological Seminary in Massachusetts? What happened to Yale? What happened to Harvard? There's always been a small flock that is really pressed for solid orthodoxy. As I mentioned in the class on Adoniram Judson, the professor of theology at Harvard in 1800 became a Unitarian. And a number of pastors got a burden for this, and that's how Andover Theological Seminary was started in 1808. Why was Princeton Theological Seminary started? Why was Union Theological Seminary in Virginia started? But the warning is there were two Union Theological Seminaries. One was in Virginia and one in New York City. Within one generation, Union Theological Seminary in New York City became totally spiritually bankrupt. The only solid professor there was William Shedd. And if that subject interests you, how modernism captured the church, there is a book of almost 1,000 pages called Crossed Fingers, How Liberalism Captured the Presbyterian Church by Gary North. And I don't recommend many of North's books, but boy was he a historian. If you love church history, it is intriguing to see what happened, how liberalism crept in so bad. Finally in 1936, Princeton Theological Seminary became so theologically corrupt that Machen left and 3 other people started Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And what's so amazing is also the gifts that God gave these men. I had a little time, so I'll tell you this, because this stuff is always intriguing to me. One of the professors at Westminster Theological Seminary is named Robert Dick Wilson. One of the professors at Princeton Theological Seminary, who was a language scholar, was Joseph Addison Alexander, the son of Archibald Alexander. J.A. Alexander learned 26 languages at Princeton. He wrote commentaries on Isaiah, Matthew, and so on. Robert Dick Wilson, by the time he entered college, knew 15 languages. He wanted so badly to establish that we can trust the reliability of the Old Testament that he mastered every language that the Old Testament had been translated in up to 600 AD. So you have this scholar at Westminster Theological Seminary that we've forgotten who learned 45 languages. But these people were so fastidious and careful for the truth that they went to that length so that we would have the encouragement to know that our Bible is reliable. So I'm going to close this early today unless somebody wants to say something before I close. Okay, I'll pray. Father, we thank you for our liberties. We thank you for the means that we have. But we know that all of the light that we have and all of the things that are abundantly offered to us on the internet and other places isn't curbing the iniquity that's sweeping across this country. Our genuine hope is that the Holy Spirit would come upon our congregations in revival, and that the iniquity would be swept away, would be pushed back, and righteousness would prevail. And we thank you for people like John Bunyan and James Guthrie and James Renwick, John Owen and others who stood still, Obadiah Holmes, the Baptist, who would not budge, even if it meant jail time, a scaffold, or a whip. But they stood firm because you upheld them. We thank you for their example to us. And above all, that the Holy Spirit helps us in the time of our trial. Be with us now in the morning service. In Jesus' name, amen.